New Orleans, June 10th, 5 p.m. "I'll be back in a bit, okay?" Emily said, more to Elliot's closed door than to her mother, who nodded wordlessly as Emily pulled the heavy apartment door closed behind her, muffling the television. The afternoon sun filled the hallway, bouncing against the chipped white walls, heating the air like a greenhouse. Emily's arms glistened with sweat as soon as she stepped into the light, but she felt instantly better. She jumped down the scuff stairs two at a time, towards the noise from the street outside. Cars honking, people laughing on their phones, the streetcar rumbling down the avenue. The sounds of life. As usual, the front door stuck in its frame, warped by the heat and rain. Emily kicked it open with a thunk, then, blinking at the sun, second-guessed herself. She had lived in New Orleans her whole life and still wasn't used to the summers. It was so hot the air shimmered, and she could barely breathe, but anything was better than going back upstairs to the sadness and the dark. Emily wiped the sweat from her eyes and jumped down the last remaining stairs. It was cooler once she reached the park, beneath the sprawling canopy of the ancient oaks, but not much cooler. Emily sat on a bench nestled at the base of an especially gnarled old tree, watching squirrels spiral up the trunk into the upper branches. Someone had hung wind chimes from the boughs, enormous 8-foot-tall tubes, and she peered into the leaves, waiting for a breeze that never came. It was only when Emily stretched, massaging the crick from her neck, that she noticed the reflection of the sky in the dirty lagoon that anchored the park. It was still and strange, like the world was holding its breath. No clouds danced across the muddy green water, and the feathers that littered its surface floated without movement, curling white castaways from the tiny island where birds nested throughout the year, growing fat off stale bread and minnows. It had been a long time since Emily had sat in the park like this, just thinking. She was usually on an adventure with Elliot, climbing trees, searching for eggs in the reeds by the murky water. Right before he had gotten sick, they followed the whooping calls of gibbons to the far side of the park by the river, where a chain-link fence separated the soccer fields from the adjoining zoo. Creeping along the perimeter, they peered into an empty animal pen until they stumbled across a small hole in the fence by a maintenance shed. Elliot had tried to convince her to sneak in, even though they had a membership at the zoo and could have gotten in for free. But she'd lost her nerve, and he tore his shirt on the rusted wire. In the distance, a gibbon whooped. Emily sighed and stared at Elliot's island. Its trees were ragged with Spanish moss, and even though its banks were only 60 feet from shore, it was easy to overlook the birds if you didn't know what to look for. The trick was to let your eyes adjust to the soft, dappled light under their feathers and beaks until they emerged like an optical illusion from the mud and bark. After that, it was hard not to see them. The herons and cattle egrets perched on low-hanging branches, the shadows filled with grebes and cormorants, and whistling ducks with tangerine feet. The little island was so brimming with life that it seemed to be breathing. As if it could feel Emily staring, the island exploded into a low flying arc of gulls and ducks. They circled the treetops twice before returning to their roosts. As they settled back down onto the crowded branches, a hot wind rose, rippling through the lagoon as thick clouds raced across the sky. Leaves rustled above Emily's head, and the giant wind chimes finally stirred so quietly that Emily could barely hear them. She rubbed the goosebumps from her arms and wondered if Elliot was okay, if she should run home. Instead, Emily picked up her book. "Any good?" A red-faced woman in a neon shirt jogged in place, checking her pulse. Behind her, a parade of hungry ducks trailed after a little girl at full waddle. The girl laughed, waving a piece of bread over her head as her father jogged to catch up. "I have 2 boys about your age," the woman said. The woman smiled as she stretched, her ponytail dripping with sweat. I just wish I could get them to be more like you. Nose in a book, right? Emily nodded blankly, but the jogger had already started running again. Her shoes chewed through the narrow dirt path, spitting out tiny clouds of dust as the little girl screeched in her wake. Emily was too old to feed the ducks now, but she rubbed her hand where a goose had bitten her years ago. It hadn't hurt, but Emily cried because it startled her. As she watched the little girl pushing her way through the scum of beaks and feathers, laughing, her bread clenched tightly in her fist, Emily decided to be braver. For Elliot. There were still a few more hours of light in the day, and she knew exactly what Elliot would want to do if he were with her, but never in a million years would he actually expect Emily to do it. Emily hadn't even been able to sneak into the zoo, and this was so much bigger. She smiled as she stood up and walked to the lagoon's edge. Looking to see that no one was watching, Emily inched her foot into the water, then took a deep breath and stepped in. Her shoes squished into the soft muck at the bottom. She could see the toes of her sneakers just beneath the surface, behind the clouds and her own grinning reflection. Her socks were wet and her shoes felt heavy, but the water wasn't so very deep, and with the haze from the heat, the trees on the little island looked a little like smudges of paint. Emily slipped her phone from her pocket and held it at arm's length, but she wasn't far enough into the lagoon for photographic proof. To convince Elliot that she'd really walked to the tiny island, she'd take a selfie when she was at least halfway there. And maybe a few pictures from the island itself, looking back at the rest of the park from the muddy banks, with the roosting ducks over her shoulders. Emily laughed as she stepped farther into the water, picturing Elliot checking his messages as she centered her face on the screen. San Juan, Puerto Rico, June 10th, 6 p.m. The lights flickered as wind buffeted the San Juan Palastro Resort and Casino. The televisions flickered too, the newscasters fading to black and then crackling back to life mid-sentence. A reporter with bleached hair and a red blazer said Valerie was on her way to becoming a hurricane and that an evacuation was already underway for the more lower-lying coastal areas. If you lived on the water, she said, it was important to get out. The gusts were faster now, 60 miles an hour over the ocean, and with the wind came waves. Surges. The more Alejo watched the televisions, the more he worried about Padrino Nando. While the evening staff bustled back and forth across the marble tiles, preparing for the storm, the news played footage of the beaches on the east side of the island. They were already underwater for the most part, with white-capped waves crashing over piers and lapping into the streets, and the worst Valerie was still over 100 miles away, they said, churning over the Atlantic, picking up speed. She would hit San Juan sometime during the night or in the early morning, and there was already gridlock on the highway, people driving inland to the mountains, honking through the rain as they inched toward Barraquintas and Orocovis. Alejo watched the broadcast from an oversized couch across from the revolving glass doors, waiting for his Padrino to spin into the lobby. He wouldn't have a choice. If the storm was as bad as they said it would be, Nando would have to come back to the Palistro. His house was on the high side of the island technically, but La Perla was nestled outside the city walls and sloping into the sea, vulnerable. Alejo had tried to call Nando twice from the telephone at the check-in desk, but he wasn't picking up. Alejo chewed his thumb, wondering if he should try to brave the weather and find him. The birds had told them that San Juan would be fine, but Alejo had more information now. He was only 12, but even he knew that it was good to get a second opinion. "Todos! Everyone!" his manager shouted. "Kitchen, now!" Despite Alejo's worry and the startling images on the televisions, the atmosphere at the San Juan Palastro Resort and Casino still seemed celebratory. The last remaining guests were all tucked into their rooms with 100 reassurances, and, even with the flickering lights, everyone smiled as they gathered into the stainless steel kitchen. The manager smiled too, winking at Alejo as she announced that there was no need to be scared. "And why not?" she asked. Alejo inched backward behind the broad shoulders of one of the landscapers. He knew why he wasn't scared. Nothing bad could happen to this place. It was too big, too expensive. But he was smart enough to know that this wasn't the answer the manager was looking for, so he kept his mouth shut and he looked at the floor. "We're not scared because we're prepared," the manager shouted, throwing open the big silver doors. That is why she gathered them into the kitchen, to eat the ice cream before it melted, to save them a lot of cleanup tomorrow when the storm had passed, just in case the power had gone out. She tossed 2 pints of vanilla to Alejo. "Special offer," she said. "One day only." Alejo accepted the ice cream with a nod, the frost melting on his hands as he squeezed his way out through the growing crowd. "Solo los perecederos, por favor," the manager shouted behind him. In the rush, some of the staff had started reaching for pillow chocolates and jars of cherries. "Just the perishables." He didn't have a spoon, so Alejo tasted the ice cream with a finger as he walked to the empty lobby. It was too sweet for him and too cold. It made his teeth hurt, but he took another taste anyway as the lights flickered off and on again, just to make sure. In the eerie quiet before the television rebooted, Alejo could hear wind howling outside. The loose ends of the ropes they'd used to tie everything down whipped against the concrete, slapping wetly without rhythm. The staff laughed and cheered in the kitchen as the manager continued to empty the freezer. But they sounded muffled and distant. It made Alejo suddenly nervous for everyone to be celebrating while Valerie was knocking on their door, like they were tempting fate. Alejo shivered, even though they were still talking about the storm. He felt better when the predictions of the newscasters filled the room again. Less scared, less alone. He almost smiled at the commentator with the white blonde hair that frowned when the picture cut away to a reporter in a yellow raincoat. There was something about the man that Alejo didn't like, something that made his stomach drop. He walked toward the television above the bar for a closer look and felt his mouth go dry. The zigzag tiles of the pool behind the reporter were eerily familiar, and he recognized the stack of blue chairs, too. In the background on the television, out of focus, obscured by the rain, was the lobby of the San Palastro Resort and Casino. Alejo clutched the 2 frozen pints of ice cream, his fingers pink with cold. "Even the most popular tourist destinations are ghost towns now," the reporter shouted. His gelled hair blew stiffly in the wind as he gestured towards the lobby. But Alejo wasn't watching anymore. He was halfway to the revolving door, walking slowly, as if the marble floor might slip out from under him. When he finally pushed outside, the wall of heat and rain hit him hard, instantly soaking his wrinkled blue shirt. Squinting against the storm, Alejo scanned the bruised green and yellow sky. The world outside was different from when he had left it. The last of the birds were gone, and it was bright, brighter than he had expected from watching the footage on the news. Alejo took a deep breath and turned back to the lobby, peering at the televisions through his dripping reflection in the glass doors. He couldn't hear the reporter over the dull roar of the wind and rain. But there he was, his wet shirt clinging to a sparrow's chest in the corner of the screen. Alejo laughed. He couldn't help himself. He turned back towards the cameras, waving the ice cream behind the reporter in case Padrino Nando was somewhere watching. Beneath him, an emergency alert ran on the bottom of the screen, bright red and flashing. From the mostly abandoned luxury suites of the San Juan Palastro all the way to Washington, D.C., viewers wondered what the boy with the big smile was so happy about. Valerie was heading right for him.